As Oisin was saying, I mean, AI has been coming up a lot, right? And we've got 40 minutes now, so we're going to figure it all out about where it's all going, what exactly is happening. Everyone's going to be an expert at the end of it, right? No, well, maybe not. But we will give a little bit of an overview as to our own perspective. So I'll start by asking the panel to introduce themselves and their connection to the area of open source AI, and maybe a comment about, well, anything they want to really. So Sayeed, I'll start with you.
Hello, I'm Sayeed Choudhury from Carnegie Mellon University. I also lead the Open Forum for AI, which is a Carnegie Mellon-led academic and nonprofit partnership looking at bending the arc toward human-centric AI. We believe in openness in AI as a core design principle. So I would say my connection is obviously through that, building on some of the foundations that have been established, including the open source AI definition, but having a broader view of that as well.
Thank you, Sayeed. And we've tried to mix this panel with get different perspectives from different sectors. So Frank, do you want to introduce yourself and your point of view there?
My name is I am part of Jentic. So we're building AI. Better.
Yes.
Okay, so
start again.
Frank Kilcommins, head of architecture at a company called Jentic. So we're a startup building tools in the digital and AI space. My biggest connection is I have worked in the open source space for a long time, working on standards, specifications, traditionally in the API space. So I sit on the board for Open API, which is a project in the Linux Foundation, and I work on specifications there, and co-author of a new specification called Arazzo, which is all about enabling business flows for AI-based ecosystems.
Thank you, Frank. Raoul.
Thank you. My name is Raoul Bredeux. I'm a legal counsel for ETH Zurich. That's the largest tech university of Switzerland. It's taxpayer funded, and I'm responsible for all the contracts in the area of computation. That means all the third-party collaborations with the big techs, and most of the projects relate in some way or other to to AI, so I want to say. And as a taxpayer-funded organization, we're bound to make openly available as much as possible of code. And it's good practice for computer science projects to release the code also open source to show what they've done. And one practical example was last year, the release of Apertus, an open source LLM model that was also taxpayer funded, and it was made available by a supercomputer infrastructure that ETH has put in all the money that comes from the watches and the cheese, and they have bought the supercomputer, which is hugely expensive, and provided an infrastructure, an open source large language model which is licensed under the Apache license, to be also adopted by the corporates, including the SMEs, all the ones that couldn't afford doing such a thing on themselves. And it's fully transparent, including the legal concept behind it, all the risk mitigation measures for compliance with, for example, data protection, copyright laws. All these things are turned into a research project and made transparent.
Thank you, Raoul. And Anna?
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna. I work at the Linux Foundation. For those unfamiliar, we're more than just hosting the Linux kernel. We expand across, we host popular and key technologies across different industries and sectors, across cloud native, across AI, PyTorch Foundation, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. You might have heard of that. That is under Linux Foundation umbrella. And we're, of course, also really engaged in open standards and open source AI projects being developed under other umbrella foundations, such as PyTorch Foundation, Jentic AI Foundation, that I will share some insights in a few minutes.
Thank you. And I mean, as you can already tell, this is a very broad topic that we're going to try and maybe just sample, I suppose, in these few minutes. But I think that there are the broad kind of areas that I think may be of interest is the idea of how organizations, small companies and maybe large companies, are thinking about open source AI, in the context. And then maybe we'll also then get to, we will then get to the whole idea from a public sector perspective in terms of what the considerations are, and then indeed maybe even practical steps in terms of how we can all work together around that. So Frank, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. You are an Irish company. You're in this area of AI. From the perspective of your business, like, how are you thinking about open source AI in general? Like, where does it play a part of your operations and in terms of how you're looking at it, what your perspective is?
Yeah, well, that's a $1 million, billion dollar, $1 trillion question. Yeah, so really the way we look at it from different angles. So we have to pick our battles. We're a startup. We're not going to compete with the incumbents that are already in the space, even though it's pretty new. But like the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic, we're not going to be competing in that space. But we have, like, in general, a traditional view to open source as well. I think Wolfgang in the last panel or panel before actually mentioned it as well. Like, we will move faster by ourselves, building and leveraging the work that has gone before us. There's, especially in industry, there's a nasty habit of us reinventing the world over and over. So what we want to do is we want to move fast. We want to use open source that will accelerate us. We also contribute back. So I've had the privilege of getting hired into my last few jobs without interviewing, because they wanted the expertise that I have in open source and standards. So we contribute back into that broader ecosystem, both through software projects. So we contribute packages back into the ecosystem, and also the standards. So we want to move together with the community, and that gets us trust and clout as a startup. So we come in and we can enable enterprise and corporations because they can trust what we're doing. They can see what we're doing. There's too many walled gardens being created now in the AI space. And thinking like a little bit further ahead from a corporate perspective, like, we fundamentally are trying to enable the enterprise to be able to leverage AI in the best way. So you have a lot of heritage technology, and we want to give organizations the ability to improve upstream of where they will be using AI. So we want to make sure that it's not a walled garden approach, that they have optionality in their future architecture, and they're in control of also their cost management.
Thank you, Frank. And I suppose thinking about that from a corporate perspective, and maybe even, Anna, if I can ask you about what you're seeing in terms of trends. So the Jentic AI Foundation within Linux Foundation, can you maybe just give a brief overview about what that's at, and like who gets involved? Like, are they just the big companies? Are they all the tech bros involved? Who's part of that whole community?
Yeah, so there are several initiatives and projects. The Jentic AI Foundation, I think, is the most popular or trendy one right now, because it was launched, I think, 2 months ago. For those unfamiliar, there are, of course, major AI providers like Anthropic, OpenAI is there, of course. But what they are doing, I think it's the intention of this foundation is really interesting, because they are focusing on developing open standards for AI. For instance, I think during the keynote, we heard about the MCP, the Model Context Protocol, donated to this foundation, to the Jentic AI Foundation by Anthropic, to create an open protocol to connect the LLMs to all the technologies like APIs, databases, under an open protocol, the same like I always compare it to the USB-C connector, right? That is able to plug to any kinds of devices. And the intention is to enable capability for companies, governments, and other stakeholders to build open source AI projects. Other initiatives, for instance, OpenChain, I don't know if you're familiar with OpenChain, is focused on building trust in the software supply chain. They develop standards and specifications, and they have a lot of companies, especially from Europe and Asia, and especially from Japan, contributing there. There are major contributors are not just big companies, there are also middle companies from Europe and also Japan contributing to those standards, and they have an AI SBOM working group where they are trying to build a standard on how to insert or integrate AI compliance in the software supply chain as a process. And there are many more, but these are just the two of them that comes to my mind.
And can you clarify, because I think sometimes it's not clear from the outset, like in terms of, I suppose, the ability for people to participate in these sorts of things, is it linked to just being like one of the big brands that are, you know, part of the foundation, or like how do organizations, small organizations maybe in Ireland, like can they get involved in this work as well?
Yeah, and I think it's a really fair question because, well, in Linux Foundation we build a membership. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's just for members to contribute. In fact, it's open source, it's open collaboration. There are working groups where work happens that any individual or any representative of any company, government can contribute, collaborate, and shape the direction of that project and that initiative.
Thanks, Anna. And I suppose, like, an attribute of the open source community is that there isn't just one center of all these sort of things. There are many conversations, many different communities. Sayeed, do you maybe want to talk as well about the opportunities for other people to get involved in different ways and how you see this, the landscape in terms of where the conversations are happening? I'm trying to get more to not just what conversations are happening, but how to get involved in the conversations.
Yeah, happy to do that. I will say that my personal goal for the panel failed. I was trying to be the last person Claire called on, but I'll go third. That's fine. So I obviously am going to think of this from the lens of the Open Forum for AI, where we are very much trying to raise the voice and influence and impact of the academic and nonprofit sector into these conversations. So we would welcome a chance to be part of this working group. Because this is not a criticism, but it's just the reality that a private sector entity is going to have a different mission and a different set of stakeholders and people they're accountable to than a university, than a nonprofit, and then a public sector organization. And it's healthy to bring all of those perspectives into something as important as the future of AI and how open source AI is defined. I think in terms of the trends, what I alluded to this morning and yesterday, if you were at the Curious event, what I've seen, I think, since 2 years since that convening I referred to, is sort of more of an unpacking of AI and an expansion of what it really means. I think we started a lot of efforts, including the OSI-led open source AI definition, with an assumption that the foundation model was the sum total of what AI is, and that if somehow we can regulate it in this context, it will solve all the issues that we're worried about around AI. And that simply hasn't happened. And that's not a criticism of any particular approach that we've taken over the past 2 years. But the realization is that it is more complex, that we have to think about multiple elements, that there are certain contexts in which trying to be binary might make sense, that if you're talking about regulation, you don't want to have a 3-hour conversation every time you're trying to think about whether something is open source AI or not. But from a developer perspective, or certainly an AI engineering perspective, you don't think about it in a binary way. You think that there are gradients of openness, and the model openness framework is a good example of that, right? That the Linux Foundation stewards. So trying to just be more nuanced and more comprehensive, I think, is going to be really important. And to me, that just reinforces the idea that this is a huge space, and that no single sector is going to solve this or address this by themselves. We just need to get everybody in multiple forums. There are lots of other forums represented on this panel and in this room, and try to get some kind of coordination effect to happen between those.
Thank you. And I'll come to Raoul now as well, because, the work that was done on Apparatus and in the Swiss effort? I mean, it does seem to be quite cross-sectoral. I mean, you're based in ETH Zurich. It was done with a nod to, you know, a national kind of solution for Switzerland in terms of its particular needs. You explicitly said that it was done with the goal to also be able to enable commercial work. Can you talk about how that came about? And like, in as much as why you did it, how you got it done, because it does seem to be like a big undertaking. And if you can just talk about that process, that would be very interesting.
I may have to explain a bit about ETH, what it is, because it is one of the most relevant Swiss public institutions. It belongs to the Swiss government. It's not a cantonal university, and it's got a huge funding, huge reputation, many checks and balances. So, and normally research is not, apart from ethics approvals, there is no generic compliance review for each and every research project. So therefore, the researchers would not greet you welcoming when you say we have to do a legal review for such a research project. And this came on a different scale. It was just releasing commercial grade large language models with all the legal questions that belong to this. And we had to do a proper assessment for making a sound management decision for approving the project, and at the same time taking the measures that are needed to have it released safe and to be in compliance with the law. Simple as that. In Switzerland, we have no AI-specific regulation, and we are not subject to AI Act. But this is short-sighted, because having the ambition of doing something that can be adopted by corporates, we want to make it suitable. And being in the shoes of the corporates who want to build upon the model, which is basically the sense to adapt, to use it, to modify it, they have to be compliant. And all the Swiss companies that distribute products and services into EU countries, they will be in the shoes of being bound to show compliance. And therefore, an outcome of this assessment was we voluntarily comply with AI Act transparency obligations. And this was very welcomed by the research team as well, because it fits pretty well into a research scientific standard of being transparent about your work. And we made a legal plus scientific documentation where all the legal mitigation measures, they would be part of the scientific transparency.
Thank you. And I mean, it's such an interesting area. And again, every time I start talking about this topic, I'm just blown away by like the breadth of what we could cover. I am going to ask you all now to pick one trend. So now we've been talking a little bit about where you're all at and where you're involved. If you were pointing to a global trend in open source AI and you're trying to think about one thing you would like to say, we need to watch this one, or we should all just pay attention to this that's happening in the world of open source AI, I'm going to ask you what you think we should all be looking at and what you think is most interesting that's coming down the line in terms of, I suppose, opportunities or risks. Sayeed, I'll start with you.
Well, you had to start with me this time. Well, I don't know if Angela's still in the room or not, but I'm going to echo what she said in the last panel. I think looking at smaller language models is the place I would start. And there are several reasons for that. Some that she articulated, that it may be relatively easier to look at the openness and the transparency of those kinds of models. But even in some somewhat perhaps strange ways, the chief for global affairs, I think, at OpenAI has said that AI is becoming infrastructure, which I believe. So I think infrastructure needs to be public, and it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be open. It's not clear to me how one would do that directly with these large foundational models. But however, if you build smaller language models, for example, in some context where regulation exists, healthcare, transportation, take your pick, water supplies, then those regulations still apply. I'm not a lawyer, but I think I'm safe in saying you don't get to just say, well, too bad. You don't get to understand how the underlying model works. We don't care if the water isn't safe or if the plane is crashed or so on. So the sort of direct approach of tell me from your large foundational model how safe it is, how transparent is what you did with the data, I don't think will be as effective. I'm not saying it shouldn't be tried and it may not have effects. But if you then say this is the underpinning for something happening in a regulated space, I don't think you get exonerated, right? And I think in some ways that's the pathway into making the infrastructure more, transparent, more open. And if you could choose not to participate, you could say, I'm not picking on them, but any of these large companies opening, I could say, no, we're not going to provide the engine to do this in medical care. But I don't think you get to say, no, we want to be involved in healthcare AI, but we're not going to tell you anything about how our model works.
Thank you, Sayeed. Anna, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think we will start seeing more developments and new around open standards, protocols, and procedures on AI. The same way this software stack needed open standards and specifications to build what the modern software looks today. I think the AI ecosystem needs that. Companies needs an open ecosystem where stakeholders, companies, academia, and also governments can build upon and can connect and make this capability of having more companies and more people, large, medium, small companies to benefit from that. So I'm seeing the same as in cloud native, they build this ecosystem. I'm seeing more open orchestrators on AI agents and protocols and so on.
Thank you, Anna. Frank, will I come to you next? You got the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll build upon what Anna said, and it probably relates to what you said as well, Sayeed. To be fair, it's thinking about standards, and especially maybe looking at this from not purely from a corporate enterprise lens. I think it's applicable to the public sector. You have to think about what differentiates you. How will you manage that intellectual property? How will you be in control of what happens to your secret sauce? If you pass that on to a closed big model, you don't know. You're losing your ability to define your own destiny. If you're operating in a regulated business, you're actually preventing an ability to be properly audited. So you need to necessarily think about how open standards can come in and can enable you to leverage generative AI in the right way. And there'll be a certain amount of what you do that is your IP that you will not want to be executed in the probabilistic space. So you will want things to happen the same way every single time. And that becomes very, very critical if that is a sensitive operation, if that's dealing with money-related transactions, health care data-related transactions, etc. So you need to be in control of that. And if you do that on top of open standards, you build up optionality and resilience into everything that you do, and you are going to be regulatory compliant at the same time.
Thank you, Frank. Raoul?
Closer to the legal side. So, and it perfectly matches what you said. So I assume going forward, we have all the models that are out there. The trick is now how to adopt these into business processes, and businesses are under pressure to show results. And going into sector-specific regulation, you will have to be able to show compliance. This is the paperwork, the boring stuff. And what comes in is creative legal support that can help you with drawing up such a documentation that is needed that satisfies regulatory requirements and where to draw from. And there, I think, this is when the standards kick in. And there has to be a cross-sector collaboration for making a sound, robust documentation showing compliance.
Thank you, Raoul. Now, I'm going to open it up to the floor. I invite questions for the panel. So if folks have a question that they would like to ask in terms of, now we're looking for a question now this time, okay? Go on, no, sorry. Did you want to join us a question? Please do, please do.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Thank you so much for that. I am fascinated by the promise and the concept of small language models, and especially open source one. I'm all my life has been in healthcare. So, but the question is, as people who have been active in this, especially for Europe, okay, I'm about to ask a bad question, especially for Europe, how do you think Europe can deal with the inevitable hardware and power demands of training the models going forward so that they can stay competitive with the gigantic ones backed and trained by United States? Thank you.
An excellent question. Thank you so much. Would anyone like to take that one? From power demands perspective?
Well, I'm not based in Europe, but what I will say is, I think we're starting to see some very clever engineering happening around the edges, again, of these large foundation models. DeepSeek's latest MHC protocol, or maybe I shouldn't call it protocol, technique is one, if you're not familiar. And by the way, I vetted this with a true AI expert at Carnegie Mellon, not just myself. If you think about the layers of a network of one of these models, this MHC approach is basically like wormhole travel, right? So instead of going one layer at a time, you can go between one similar spot in layer 1 to layer 50 automatically. So if you've ever watched science fiction movies, there's two models. You go to sleep and things go terribly badly when you wake up, or you use a wormhole and you get to someplace very quickly. So MHC is very much like the wormhole. This has profound implications for the efficiency, performance, and energy usage of these models, right? So I think, and again, I'm not in any way saying this is not a question that Europe should think about, or the US, or anyone should think about from a regional perspective. But I think we should encourage the adoption of these kinds of techniques across the planet. And basically say, if you have a technique where the performance is at least comparable, and the energy usage is, I think you had a quote of something that was 50,000 times more efficient. Yeah. To me, it seems like, gee, how much do you really need that precision? Does it matter to you that the temperature is 21.3 versus it's 20 to 22 and it's 50,000 times less energy efficient? I think those are questions we should ask ourselves.
I would just like to add into that, and this is just a reference to your presentation earlier as well, Sayeed. I mean, my understanding is that the work that's happening in the African continent is like really focusing in this area as well. And so when we're looking to where we're taking our technology and expertise from, I think we need to think broader than where we normally go. And these are the people who are motivated to explicitly focus on that particular area. And I think there's loads of great innovation happening there. So I'll just add that in, and I'll come over here. Oh, thank you.
Just on that point as well, I think around the edges of the model development, a lot of folks can think around what needs or what tasks need to be given to the model to solve versus what capabilities need to be provided to the models to just leverage. MCP gives a porthole into that, but if you can't manage context correctly, then that's never going to be effective. And you don't want, let's say, the agent-based algorithms that are out there trying to figure out stuff that's already well known. So you should say, no, we want this to be deterministic and execute every time, and you're not going to be burning the world while you're doing that at scale.
Hello. So a former Google exec and one of the top 100 most influential people in AI said a few years ago, not literally, but something like, Europe isn't lagging behind in AI. It's not even yet there to lag behind. I mean, that's how far back we are. Yeah. And so I don't know, Deutsche Telekom in Germany is creating a cloud, a stack with like, I don't know, 0.01% of what, you know, the US has and so forth. So, you know, the point is, the question is, what can we do as Europe? Is open source going to help us in AI to, you know, get back into the game, or what should we do?
Anna?
Here I'm speaking on my own. I just want to clarify. And these are just my opinion as a Spanish citizen based in Europe. So I don't know, when I have talked in my last year with folks for companies from Europe, I just feel like we love to see our things in a bubble. Like Spanish is, no, we're gonna build a Spanish model, and these are our things. And then you talk with France and say, no, we're going to be best. And we're still having these issues across countries. And I feel like sometimes we like to reinvent the wheel when there is already communities and projects out there that by knowing how to contribute and having talent to contribute and to engage in those existing ecosystems, we can benefit a lot instead of trying to create what has been already been there because, oh no, that's already there. And there are other companies from other countries collaborating. I mean, I feel like open source is a nice way to start to have directions and have voice because of the true culture of open source. And I will just take a step back perhaps as EU citizens and say what's going on there in terms of standards, on open standards or on open collaboration there, and look more into how to strategically contribute and have a voice into those communities and those projects and benefit from the knowledge and the projects that are already being developed there. But that's my, just as a citizen and individual opinion.
I may also come in on this as another EU citizen, but just in terms of, I'll go back to my previous contemplation as well about when we think that the US is so far ahead, what do we really mean? There's a couple of companies with big proprietary LLMs, but when you look at where it actually will hit the ground and where it's being implemented and adopted and in what scenarios and in what considerations that we've been just talking about here, are the US really ahead in that area? I don't know. I don't think so. And one of the things that I think about when I think about open source is that it won because it was more frictionless to adopt open source. And I'm thinking, does that mean that therefore in the adoption race, not in the big model creation, big company, big pocketbooks that can buy more GPU space, let them at it. If the race is really about to impact and where it's actually going to have impact, maybe we can win there. Because for me, this is the idea of, and everything we talked about here was about building contextualized AI that works in certain circumstances and solves particular problems. If we focus on that and we can get them to solve problems faster, then that's still an open game. Like there's no one winning at that yet. And we could win in Europe as easily as anyone. And in fact, we have many diverse opinions that we can bring to the table. Maybe we have to get better at working together across Europe. But at the same time, it's all to play for in my mind.
Thank you. Not a question, just to kind of build on what you were all saying. I think Europe should focus on what we're good at. I think a lot of people think that the diversity and the disagreements we have in Europe across state level are a weakness, whereas they're probably our superpower, right? You go to Africa, you ask someone where they're from, they say, well, I'm African. You go to the US, you ask someone, I'm American, right? You don't get that in Europe. But I think it gives a lot of great strengths. And one example is, I know just randomly, legislation around food and food quality. I think we hold the rest of the world accountable on that with trade deals we do around the world. So why don't we do something similar with AI? Just hold everybody accountable.
To one point, I think it relates to your point and the question you asked, Claire, and I certainly don't represent all of the US. Please don't assume that. But I will say that one phrase which is resonating across both sides of the political spectrum in the United States is permissionless innovation will always win. And that is profoundly connected to open source, right? So if I have to go and ask a company for innovation on top of their model, that introduces friction into the system. If I don't have to do that, it's permissionless. And we have lots of evidence that there are a lot of benefits for that. And that's even becoming acknowledged even within the US at this point.
Yeah, just in terms of, thanks very much, Claire, for allowing us to come. We're imposters from Germany. A few of my friends work in California, and the policymakers in Europe would have, I'd say, invested an awful lot of time and effort and energy in creating EU AI acts. And I think, and I've always worked in technology, think globally, act locally. And this idea of law is an ass. I studied law years and years ago in UCD. Again, imposter, sorry. The law is an ass and it follows and prevents innovation on a global level from a local source, if you like. And I'd be curious, as a Swiss man or a person living in Switzerland, this idea of innovation versus legal restrictions, what your opinion might be.
First answer is the thing that permissionless. This comes from the very idea of open source contracts. When I came the first time across such it's an IP licensing agreement, which is just offered in before. You don't have to put the signature on it. It is just there. And this is a very attractive idea. So you can just make use in accordance with these terms. This is the smart thing that we shouldn't lose. And we shouldn't jeopardize this with too much regulation. Switzerland has a tradition of being very, very liberal. So all regulation has to really be very well justified. If not, it won't happen. So, and we have a very direct policy system where anything that is not convincing will not happen. So, and in this regard, we have a skeptical view towards the EU and AI Act because it's just too much bureaucracy for getting a thing started, which is very different in Switzerland. We have, I have lately been negotiating an agreement for funding from a Sprint, it is called, a regime in Germany, a framework for research funding. And it was very complicated. And I just could compare the same thing in Switzerland is, yeah, it is much easier to get the thing done with corporates on the other side. So, and I would really advocate we should keep a liberal to remain liberal as much as we can and not to put too much regulation on top of the open source. The open source world where it is easy to just kick off and see what's there, and you can pick in compliance with the rules that are just set.
And just to comment on that, because I know that, and for those of you who may have missed Kieran's talk earlier around the things like the Cyber Resiliency Act and the AI Act, there's a lot of regulation coming out. And I think this is, it's almost overwhelming for anyone in the technology industry not to mind open source. There are, of course, some carve-outs for open source in the context of those acts, and it's important for us all to know about it. But the European Commission spoke at FOSDEM when I was there last week, and they had this FAQ about it. But what really struck me about the whole conversation was that they were distinguishing between the idea of developing innovative solutions and where they are adopted or applied. So they had this time thing to say, like, you know, you can go no obligations if you're developing innovation, but if you're making it available to the market in a commercial way, this is when these regulations apply. And it was very clear there was this separation between the development and the adoption of the technology and the provision of the technology. It's very important for us to keep that in mind. Like, there's an awful lot of these regulations don't apply when you're developing stuff. They apply when you're making them commercially available. So we have to think about that. It's not putting constraints on the development. It's putting constraints on selling them into the European market. And that's for all regions selling into the community. So how is that disadvantaging us? Because it's everyone has to apply those regulations when they're selling into the European market. So again, when we think about the regional disparities, we just have to remember the context of where maybe those regulations and constraints apply as well. But I fully agree we should make it more frictionless to get it all done in the first place. Thank you, Raoul.